we should be live now. Welcome to another live stream repair here. We've got just one HomePod in today from Kevin, and it's got no power. So let's crack that on open, see if we can't get that fixed up. Now let's see. How do I get in this box? There we go. Okay. Here we go. Now let's get this plugged into some power and just do some sanity checking here. So, indeed, no signs of life, no power here, and about 6 watts at the wall. So, like always, pretty indicative of a shorted diode on the amplifier inside. So let's crack it open and see what we've got going on in there. I'm going to get our pry tool, of course, here. Just get underneath that top and work it off. Alright, and then we can get our T6, take those 4 screws out for the display. And we can pry that display on up and out of here. Then we can get the frame unscrewed and out of the way. Pull that logic board out, set that to the side, get that mesh pulled down, and expose these screws for the upper plastic basket here. Get that logic cable here detached before we start prying this thing up. Before we forget. Then we can take those screws out before we start prying this basket off. Alright, all those screws are out. We can get our big flat head and pry this off. Coming up pretty easy for us. It's always nice. But I think we'll have to do the rest of this by hand. Let's see, and too easy. All right. Now we can get the woofer here unscrewed and removed. Take a peek of that voice coil in the woofer here. It looks good. Smells good. Nothing funny going on there. So let's get these gaskets out. And then we can get this power supply out. Since we saw some power draw at the wall, we have very little reason to suspect the fuse has blown, so we'll get the power supply out of the way, then we can pull the amplifier out and take a look at the common failure for those amplifiers that causes this no power issue. Alright, we can get this amp pulled out, set their shell to the side, and let's get our close-up camera so we can do a quick inspection here. Let's see. All right. What have we got? So that's our usual suspect for no power. This diode right here. See, we've got a date code of 1748K, so these ones seem to be the ones that most commonly fail. So we'll get this diode pulled off. It's probably shorted out. If you take a multimeter to this in continuity mode and test it, it will probably show shorted. But I'm not going to bother. We're just going to jump right in and get this diode replaced. And then we will do a quick power on test and see if there's any DC offset that needs to be taken care of while we're in here. So we'll get our hot air. And we're just going to quickly hit the back of this board with a little bit of heat, so that way when we hit the diode with the heat, it won't take so much of that heat away from the board. We get that board preheated, then there's less fighting that we have to do once we actually flip this around. And so we're just going to keep the heat on there and keep poking it until we start seeing that solder ooze out of the bottom when we push on it. Now you see that? And then we can just push it straight down, avoiding that little capacitor on the left-hand side. And we got it off. Now, we can grab ourselves a new diode. And get that prepared for installation on the board here. And just a little bit of flux. Also put a little on our board. And we'll get our soldering iron. Get that turned on. Our iron is taking its sweet time warming up. No worries. All right. I'm just gonna pop that bad boy on there. Line it up as best as we can by hand. And then go back to town with that heat. And we're going to start just heating it up until we see it start to settle in, that solder melt. And when we see it melt, we're going to gently push and hold this down. Give it a few more seconds of heat and then pull the heat away while continuing to hold that down until we see that solder solidify. And right there. So let's just give this board a second to cool back down. We'll wipe off some of that excess flux, and then we'll put this together on the test bench to sanity check our work and see if there's any DC to fix up. Some of that DC offset. Just giving it a chance to cool down here. And then we'll grab a power supply, get that connected, put some screws on it so it doesn't go anywhere. And we'll get a logic board cable. Get that connected and locked into place so that we can connect our logic board. This is my test logic board that's got a display on it and it's already set up and ready to go. And we'll get our subwoofer over here, we'll plug that in. And I've also got my multimeter connected to the woofer over here. So we'll get that turned on and set it to DC millivolts. And then of course we'll get our power leads here for the AC connection. Get that connected. And then we'll finally plug that other end into the wall. And we will tap the top of this to see if it's booting up. And in fact it is. So good news, our no power repair of course worked and it's now booting up. So let's wait for this to finish booting, and once it finishes booting, as we just saw, we can tap it again really quick to wake it up, so that way we can see how much DC the amplifier is putting into the woofer here, if any. And we've got a spectacular result of about 0 millivolts. So that is a wonderful result. If I saw 50 millivolts or more, and or I saw this this number drastically increasing or steadily increasing, that would warrant going through with the DC offset repair, replacing those filtering capacitors. But here we don't have any signs of that, so we can go on ahead and tear this down and throw it all the way back together and get this one on its way. So we're just taking off all those test parts here so that we can make room to drop this back into the shell. Alright, get that shell, speaking of, and carefully place the amplifier back inside. Cool. Then we can proceed with those 14 screws holding the amp down. quick zoom in here. Just a few more screws for that amp. Awesome. Now before we drop the power supply in, let's just get that logic cable reconnected to the amp here. Don't want to forget that, and then have to tear this all apart again. Very good. And we can get our power supply and get that all lined up. Push down to lock that connector on the bottom and reconnect the AC cable there. Then we can screw that down. We can start working our gaskets back in, starting with the bottom one, of course. We want to pull this off so that we can more easily put it back on with this next gasket here. And then screw that down. This is interesting. It looks like the factory put two holes here. They screwed one of them up and put another one there. Looks like over here this one's the same thing. It's like they barely missed it or something. Weird. This is a brand new HomePod too. Well, relatively. It's brand new. It's not like a factory refurbished or repaired model. So that's interesting. Shouldn't be any problems though. Those holes don't poke all the way through, so it's not going to cause any problems with the seal. And speaking of, let's get that logic cable gasket back on so we don't forget it. Then we can grab our woofer. Plug that back in. And don't forget that woofer gasket here. Before we drop the woofer down, let's get that lined up. good. Feed that logic cable through the woofer. Awesome. So now we can screw that on down. Get that top basket over here and drop that in place. Put those screws back in. Last screw for this part. There we go. Let's stick that logic cable back to the top of the basket here so it doesn't rattle around the woofer. There we go. Then we can slide this mesh back up just a little bit, enough to hold our rubber screw covers in place here. Then we can start pulling that back up. If any of your rubber pieces pop out, just slide that down, put it back in. Get our logic cable our logic board put back in. Make sure that's nice and settled. Get that frame and wrap the strings around and feed those in. And then we will loosely put these screws for the frame in so that it stays in place, but we can tighten the mesh up around it before we screw that down all the way. So we'll grab those drawstrings and we're just going to pull them both straight up as we use our other hand here and just squeeze that mesh into place, assisting the lip of that mesh there into the lip of the frame, so we get that nice, pretty, beautiful OEM look again. If I didn't know better, this is probably how they put them together in the factory. Then we can screw those down so the mesh stays in place. Get the screws for the drawstring. Bah. Put that in. Screw the other one in. Get those wrapped up. And this is your last chance to really make sure you've got that mesh in there nice and well before we put these last few layers back on. Got our display here, so we'll reconnect that. Set it in place. And screw that down. Just 2 more screws and we'll be just about all done with this. All right. Let's make sure there's nothing obstructing the volume indicators here. Sometimes the adhesive likes to get all stringy and obfuscate these a little bit. You also want to check your top touch cover here, and I can see, like right here, a little bit of the adhesive is covering up the symbol here, so we're just gonna make sure that's all clean. All right. If we want, we can stick a flashlight under that just to make sure that that looks good. All right. So let's grab our heat. Get this adhesive nice and warm and sticky again. Being real careful with our heat here. We don't want to damage any parts. A good rule of thumb for me when you're using heat near cosmetic pieces is if it's too hot for you to hold with your hand, you're probably getting it too hot, period. So you see here, I'm just barely keeping this hot enough to where I can still hold this part, but not letting it get too hot that it burns my hands, obviously, because then that would probably be approaching too hot for the part itself. Just a good little personal rule of thumb there. And we'll set that gun to the side and line this up by eye. Once we've got that lined up and we're happy with that, we can push that back down. Don't want to push on it with all of our weight because you could start breaking parts on the inside. But be firm with it. You don't want it popping off if you're shipping this thing. And then if we want, we can sanity check that that's nice and flat and centered all around. You can't even tell it's been apart. And then we'll make sure that this is nice and lined up. It should just snap into place if it's not, and it should look nice and flush if it is. And then we can connect this to some power and see what we've got. And the verdict is, got it all working. We'll just wait for it to boot up, of course, and do a quick sound check, and that our volume buttons still light up nice and even. All right, now let's check.
I'm having trouble connecting to the internet. For more info,
good.
check the Home app.
Sounds great. And what about our volume buttons? Volume buttons are nice.
I'm having trouble.
Yeah, I know you're having trouble.
I'm having trouble.
Show me the volume buttons.
I'm having trouble connecting to the internet.
All right. Well, we saw it.
I'm having trouble.
Oh, now I've made her unhappy.
I'm having trouble connect.
But I can't get the volume
I'm having
buttons
trouble.
back. I'm not going to bother resetting this and, just to pair it, just to play music, just to see the volume buttons are lined up. We saw that, so I think we're all good to go. Got nothing else to fix up on this guy, so I think we're all ready to go for the day. Got a question. Do the strings ever break when pulling the mesh? I have never had those strings break on me yet, and I've pulled pretty hard on those strings on a couple of them. I would be really surprised if by physical force you were able to pull those strings and break them. If those strings break, it's more likely that there was some physical damage to the mesh or those strings before you went and pulled on them. If they're compromised, then of course they're probably not going to hold very much and you can rip them off. But in general, those strings are pretty hardy. You can pull on them with quite a bit of force. At the very least, with about as much force as the weight of the HomePod, so about 6 to 8 pounds. They're not going to break. Very, very difficult to break. Just be careful when you're pulling the strings up that you don't... I believe it's one string that goes all the way around. So if you pull on just one end, you can potentially pull the string all the way out and kind of screw yourself. But generally, it's pretty difficult to mess up the strings. So, does the power cable pull out easily? Yes, it does. So we've got our power cable here. I don't even have it fully installed, so I'll do that really quick, and you'll know it's installed by that click that it makes, and it should be nice and flush. To remove this power cable, set it down Set it down on the table. Put your hand over the pod, and then take your other hand and get a good little bit of loop here that you can hold on to. and just yank it off. It's that easy. Yeah, pretty easy. And then to plug the power cable back in, that's pretty simple. Again, just insert it. There are two ways to, this will go in the right way and the wrong way, but technically if you plug it in backwards, it's not going to fry anything. It's just going to look a little odd. So to put this back in, you just firmly push it in until it clicks. So
I'm having trouble.
again, okay, cool. Volume button's nice and evenly lit up, so that's all good. Glad we saw that. But again, to unplug the power cable, one hand on the pod, hold it down, get some slack with the other on that cable, and just yank it right out. Super easy. It may look and sound a little more difficult on video than it really is, but very easy. So yeah, thanks for the questions. I'm glad we got some good questions out there. But if there are, and I will add, I've used the same cable for all of my repairs, and this cable has probably gone through at least 100 HomePods at this point. So you don't need to worry about this breaking or wearing out just by unplugging it and plugging it in. If this one can last at least 100 pods with my abuse, yours can almost certainly last a handful of times on your own. So yeah, I think we're all good for today. So if there aren't any other questions, I'm gonna let you guys have the rest of your day. I'll have the rest of mine, and we'll get this one cleaned up and packed up and ready for return tomorrow. So thank you all for tuning in and watching, and thank you guys for the questions. I really appreciate it. Makes me feel like people are kind of paying attention, and I like the engagement. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Goodbye. Oh yeah, I will check my email. You got it. All right, goodbye for real. Goodbye, bye.